On this Veterans Day, Vice President Pence visited the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. He and his wife Karen joined volunteers in washing that wall, bearing the names of Americans killed in the war. And later this morning, the Pences will take part in ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery. President Trump, he's in Vietnam right now, where a state dinner kicked off. It's being held in Hanoi. The dinner started with remarks from both presidents, who praised each other and talked of mutual cooperation. Joining me now, Admiral James Stavridis, NBC and MSNBC Chief International Security and Diplomatic Analyst, also Dean of the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Admiral, it's great to speak with you again, sir, and I want to get your take on something that has come up a few times during the president's Asia visit, and it is his touting of the U.S. economy. What do you think the president's trying to do?
He's really playing to a domestic audience with that, I think, Alex. Frankly, people in Asia are much more interested in the security side of the equation. But when President Trump takes every opportunity to talk about the height of the stock market and so forth, he's really playing back to his domestic audience. He wants to appear large and in charge, kind of presidential in the United States, and he feels that gives him leverage overseas. But frankly, in Asia, they're concerned about the security situation, not the heights of the U.S. economy.
And I want to ask you in just a moment about that relative to North Korea and beyond. But the president has said, while speaking with President Putin, that he brought up questions of the Russian meddling. Putin denied it. Do we actually expect Putin to admit it? I mean, is the president just trying to satisfy his critics? Is he not really interested in Russia's involvement?
That's really the only conclusion you can begin to draw here, Alex. And as you look at the investigation by a former director of the FBI, Mueller, it's clanking at President Trump like a Panzer tank. And the president is trying to kind of distract from it and diminish it. And he's frankly launching a preemptive strike on it by saying that the whole investigation is a Democratic hit job. Hey, 17 agencies of the U.S. intelligence community have clearly stated that Russia interfered in these elections. So I think it's a losing strategy for President Trump to try and misdirect like that. He's going to have to deal with this when he comes home. It'll be waiting for him.
All right, let's talk about North Korea now, sir. There was some expectation Kim Jong-un would try to test a missile while the president was there in South Asia. We've not seen anything from him in nearly 2 months. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's tempting to say that the president's rhetoric, which was very strong and I thought on point, because it also kept open the door for diplomatic relations, was a factor. I think it's tempting to say that the presence of 3 aircraft carrier strike groups simultaneously operating off the coast of North Korea is having a salutary effect on Kim Jong-un. That's tempting. But I think in reality, China is finally beginning to exert some real pressure on Kim Jong-un. And they do it because the ultimate nightmare for China is a war on that peninsula. So let us hope that the Chinese are actually jerking back on the choke chain a little bit with Kim Jong-un. Maybe it's a combination of those factors, but all are important because we must avoid a war on the Korean peninsula, Alex, which, as you know, would result in probably 1 million to 2 million casualties.
It certainly would be a tragedy in the making, for sure. As you know, sir, it's a major trip for the president in terms of geopolitics. The president telling reporters on board Air Force One he's got great relationships with South Asian leaders. Why does he frame it personally, these one-on-one terms? Do personal relationships really matter? Does he need to focus more on the relationship between the countries as opposed to the leaders?
He absolutely does. Great powers have enormous leaders, but in the end, it is the interests of the nation that drives geopolitics. We've seen that again and again in history. And he's making a mistake to think that the art of the deal that you can conduct in Manhattan, where personal relationships are quite important, is going to play out with a Vladimir Putin or President Xi or any other leader. The big meeting he's got coming up, Alex, is with the leader of India, with Modi, when he arrives in the Philippines tomorrow. But these personal relationships can add a little flavor and color, but at the end of the day, it's geopolitics, economics that will drive it. That's why the U.S. decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was such a loss for the country. President Trump overestimates what he can get out of a handshake. He underestimates what he can get out of a functioning State Department and real geopolitical connectors between nations.
Yeah, the only one of the 12 countries that has dropped out, leaving those 11 to work together. I do have to ask you about this effort to give the president less power when it comes to having his finger on the button, so to speak. You've got Senator Bob Corker, who wants to hold a Senate hearing and examine the president's authority to use nuclear weapons. Admiral, what do you make of that? Can the Senate limit the president's power there?
This is a very tricky one, Alex. We haven't really looked at this since the 1970s. It's probably time to re-examine this idea of preemptive nuclear war. In other words, the ability of the president to launch an initial nuclear strike. That existed in the past for deterrence when we faced the Soviet Union. I think it is time to have a hearing about that. On the other hand, the president has to have the authority to respond quickly in the case of an incoming nuclear attack. It's a system built for speed, and it is indeed time to look at it. But I personally would be very concerned about trying to interject 535 members of the Congress in a fast-moving war-fighting scenario. There's probably some middle ground in there. Time to have a conversation, especially with an extremely mercurial president at the helm.
Your insights are very much appreciated. Admiral James Stavridis, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Alex.
Senate candidate Roy Moore denying